So, David, David, systems thinking, complexity, right? Complicated. But let's start with something basic, if we can. Is that all right?
Sure.
Now, I think everybody will be able to understand that when we learn things very often in school, we tend to learn things in a fact by fact, subject by subject, department by department, linear way.
Right.
Now, can you just open up this conversation for us on the topic of what is the difference between what I just said and systems thinking at its most fundamental, and why there is such a thing as that difference being important?
Uh, as you said, in school, we tend to be exposed to what I would call linear or conventional thinking. And it basically, first of all, divides the world into parts, as you said, different disciplines, and assumes that the more we understand about each part and work to optimize each part, the better things will go, the more we'll be able to improve the world. And what systems thinking is saying is, au contraire, in order to improve the performance of a system, you actually have to understand and improve the relationships among the parts of the system. So a system is defined as an interconnected set of elements that work in a coordinated way to achieve something. Now, that sounds like a rather vague definition, but there's some very important insight in that definition.
Right. To me, it sounds like a pointer to see all those parts in relationship for whatever the situation or system is.
Right. And what it suggests is that no matter how dysfunctional a quote unquote system appears, it's actually accomplishing something. It may not be what we want it to accomplish or think we want it to accomplish, but it's actually accomplishing something. When in fact, what systems thinking is about is it's understanding those interconnections in such a way as to achieve a desired
Hmm.
purpose.
Right.
So understanding the distinction between what is being accomplished and what we say we want a system to accomplish is critical to this work. And there are some very important differences between how we typically got educated and the way a system actually behaves. One of those is if you want to improve the performance of a system, you don't try to optimize each part separately. You actually try to understand the interconnections and work to improve the relationships among the different parts.
Right. And we're going to get into more detail in a moment, but just as we're still lingering just for this remaining moment here on this introduction, when people, whether they're working with organizations, climate scientists, social matters, personal life issues, creating projects, what difference in their quality of decision making tends to occur when, like, just at the brass tacks, at the cash value, the check payoff of this tool, it brings people into a better way to understand the choices that actually make a difference. Can you talk more about that and like what there is to gain from understanding this?
Well, first of all, I think what you're pointing to is as leaders and as human beings, we tend to be very reactive. We take what's immediately before us and feel that we have to act on it directly. When in fact, when we understand a system, we recognize a very important difference between the way a problem shows up, the symptoms, the presenting problem, if you will, and where the root causes of that problem are. So, as leaders, the first thing we do if we begin to understand something systemically is to step back from the obvious problem and the obvious solution and inquire more deeply into why that problem persists, often despite people's best efforts to solve it. So one of the huge benefits of this work is to leverage limited resources, because actually we can spend an enormous amount of time and resource chasing the wrong problem and the wrong solutions. So this is designed to hone our abilities individually and most importantly, collectively, to understand why a problem persists or why it's been hard for us to achieve a particular goal, often despite throwing a lot of resources at it.
Awesome. So simplicity at the end of the day, in some degree, it sounds like a result.
Simplicity is key. Einstein said you want to make your insights essential, and essential means simple, not necessarily adding all of the complexity, which can tend to overwhelm us, but really looking to distill the essence of what's going on. And some of those distinctions are when we're reacting to a problem, not only do we jump to an obvious solution, like I cut my hand and I put a Band-Aid on it, but we also tend to blame other people, other parts of the system, for our not making more progress, instead of uncovering how we often unwittingly, unintentionally contribute to the very problems that we're trying to solve. And in that is the leverage of recognizing where we actually have the greatest control over the performance of the system, at least initially, which is through our own intentions, our own thinking, and our own behavior.
Okay, fantastic. Does that sound good to everybody? Does that make some bit of sense? Nod yes if that sounds like you were understanding. Okay, so what I'd like to do now, David and everybody, Brian, Jonathan, Rose, John, Nick, Molly, everybody, I'd like to do 4 things. I'd like to quickly run through some of the specific techniques involved in this mysterious practice of system. I'd like to just quickly, and I got some pictures here to quickly, boom, 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 show some of these so that there's some specificity on the techniques. But then I want to talk about David's work in particular, because David, speaking to you directly, what I value a lot about your work in your book, you talk about it right there. You say systems thinking, your approach of it is to take it out of the realm of the calculations and the math of it and to put it into a change-making process that I think you've done well. And I really think we'll all gain a lot of value if we can spend a big piece of today, if not the sort of the background thread of today, being about how to use this in a change-making process in terms of using this holistic thinking way in a linear service method that you've put together and used with companies and organizations. But we'd love to talk about that. 2 more things. Number 1, I think for a lot of people, a big focus with this work is the human factors. And I say that because and I'm not just saying this myself, this is the work itself, this is systems thinking. The deepest point of leverage, in other words, the place to make the change that makes the biggest difference, is on things like concepts and mental models and beliefs and intentions. And we were going to talk about that. We're going to give some special attention to that. But now this is for everybody. John, Micah, Madhav, Jameis, Andrew, Bob, Greg, Jared, Jane, Molly, Bars, everybody. I want to give special privilege to one type of communication here today above everything, even everything I just said already. And David, hopefully this is okay with you, that if anybody here at any moment gets the idea that there's a specific challenge in their life that some of these tools we're talking about could map onto. I'd love to say, hey, you know what, David, I got a little chat in the Zoom chat over here from so-and-so on the topic of XYZ, and let's sidebar right now, right here, right now, and we're going to address this for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and see where it takes us. And so I'm giving that invitation as that will be the centered speech in today's workshop, if that makes sense, like the usability. And if nobody wants to do that, then I'll do it myself. But okay. Okay, we're gonna run through the basic techniques, the actual, tools. We're going to look at David's work in change process, right? Because by the way, systems thinking is different than transformational change leadership, even though they work together. But we're going to go over David's work in that latter area. We're going to focus on human factors like mental models, belief, emotion. But most important, if you have a specific challenge or opportunity that matters to you, and you want to discuss it through the lens of these tools, please immediately reach out to me on this Zoom chat, and we will bring that into the subject matter. Because what good is any of this if we don't use it? Am I right about that, everybody? Boom, 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 boom. Thank you for being here, by the way, everybody, David, everybody. I met David 2 years ago once, and I told him some work I was working on, and it's been very happy. Do you all see my screen? Do you all see this pyramid shape here, triangle, right? So basically, one of the tools that goes into this is just approaching a problem, a situation, with the knowledge that, hey, there are things deeper than just the surface level. We already talked about that, right? But that's the foundation. But then we get into things like looking at pictures like this, right? And this is essentially, diagrams like this and like this and this. And David, I'm wondering if just for a few moments you could talk to us about some of the tools that are actually being used in here, and like what's the mindset or the logic that this tool demonstrates, and then we'll go into the usage of it, or any of these three.
Okay. So very quickly, I'll share a story. I had been introducing this work to people in a class, and I asked them to use the tools to understand a particular chronic complex problem that they've been dealing with. And this person, everybody worked on it. One guy was so excited after a while, he came up to me and he said, wow, I really see this. And to think I have been going in circles on this for years. And I realized at that point, the problem is not so much that you've been going in circles, it's that you haven't seen the circles that you've been going in. And we can go in circles on a problem for a long time, feeling like we've made some progress, often, in fact, making progress in the short run, only to discover ourselves back to square one or even further behind over time. And the reason for that is that we have been going in circles where it looks like we're making progress, but then the system operates in such a way as to create longer-term unintended consequences of our well-intentioned solutions that actually neutralize the benefits of what we accomplished initially or make things worse over time. And Jared, a diagram like the one you have up there now is an example of showing different types of these circles. The top one, that small one on top, is designed to show a quick fix, a solution that works in the short term, but actually undermines our ability to implement a more fundamental solution, which is the bottom small circle. And this one is particularly a case around ending homelessness. And the difference between the quick fix of adding temporary shelters and emergency supports for homeless people on the top, and implementing the more fundamental solution of permanent, supportive, safe, and affordable housing on the bottom. And those outside loops, one on either side, left and right, are unintended, longer term unintended consequences of depending on this quick fix of shelters and emergency supports that actually make it harder to implement this permanent, safe, supportable housing, affordable housing in the long run. So these loops, one, are designed to help us see the differences between the short-term consequences of our actions and the longer-term consequences of those same actions, and to see how what we do in the short term actually makes it harder for us to accomplish what we want to in the long term. And you can think of the loops, when told in a particular way, as a storyboard. They're designed to help tell a story of why, despite our best efforts, we're not getting as far as we think we should be.
If you were to read this and thank you, by the way, for that explanation. If you were to read this, where would you start? Like, where does reading this chart, where do you begin and where do you go next? And is there kind of a...
Okay. I would start with the center in this particular one, because it'll vary depending on what the diagram is. In this particular case, the problem symptom is the center, which is the number of homeless people, which obviously keeps growing. The top variable, the temporary shelters and supports, indicates the quick fix, what we do in the short term to reduce the number of homeless people or to make their lives more manageable, tolerable in the short term, which is to provide temporary shelters. The idea here is that in the short run, providing those shelters does put a roof over people's heads. But as we know, there are term limits on shelters. You can only stay for a certain number of nights, and then you're either back out in the street, you're in the ER, you're in the police station, wherever it is you end up, and you can cycle through these different types of emergency supports, if you will, before you end up back in another homeless shelter. And by the way, donors love homeless shelters because they can demonstrate that they are, in fact, giving people a roof over their heads. And yet, if you're thinking that the fundamental solution here is to end homelessness, or the fundamental goal, is to end homelessness, then to be able to walk around a homeless shelter and see all the beds full with people doesn't seem like the right metric. It would seem like if you wanted to end homelessness, you would want to see no people in your shelter beds, or people moving very quickly from this temporary quick fix into more permanent housing. And the bottom loop here, so I would go from the top back down to the bottom permanent housing, critical services, and employment indicates a more fundamental solution to reduce homelessness in the long term. The dashed lines across the arrows indicate time delay. So even though this is a more fundamental solution, it takes longer to implement. And that is critical, because the people who invest in reducing homelessness, like most of us, want to see short-term results that we can feel good about. That's true for the donors, that's true for the elected officials, and that's true for the service providers. So everybody feels like they're accomplishing something by depending on these shelters. when in fact, again, it's making life harder for homeless people over time.
Right. So
And then the thought bubbles, those little thought bubbles are the mental models, Jared, that you were referring to, the underlying beliefs and assumptions that people hold that perpetuate this system.
yep.
And the one other quick thing I'll say about it, it's an example of a particular type of archetypal or common dynamic in complex social systems. It's called shifting the burden. Shifting the burden in this case from a more fundamental solution to a quick fix. And the other term for this is addiction. This is the underlying dynamic of an addictive process where we become addicted to using more and more of the quick fix over time and less of the fundamental solution, even though we say it's the fundamental solution that we want to implement.
Right. And so let me ask you this question. How much time of research and communication did it take to produce this chart such that now we can look at it and say, here's the situation? Like, what does it actually take to, in this particular situation, get all these facts realized like this?
I think it took a few months, and the most of the information here came from interviews with different stakeholders in the system. So interviews with service providers, with people in the private sector, with people in government, nonprofits, the foundations that were involved in funding the shelter system. And there were some reports that we reviewed as well to understand some of the actual hard quantitative data that was available. But it really took only between doing the interviews and putting together a map like this, a few months.
Okay. You know, one thing that I remember Robert Fritz talking about, who we've interviewed here as well as who is your colleague, he talks about, systems thinking looks at the idea that everything is connected, but like decidedly in a very specific way. Like, in other words, not like in the way that people might say, well, homeless is connected to this and it's just all connected. You just got to da da da. Like there's a very like rigorous formulation to this.
Yeah, there is.
Sorry, go ahead.
Coming back to Einstein's quote, you want to come up with insights that are as simple as possible, but no simpler. Right. So you don't want to ignore the underlying essence of the challenges that are involved, but you also don't want to throw in everything you can think of, which would actually tend to make it harder,
right,
to distill the essence of what's going on, why it's going on, and the nature of the challenge to the people involved that it presents.
And to that effect, and then we're going to shift towards more tools and everything else we already talked about. To that effect, one of the things that really gave me a big aha when I was reading your book, where this diagram came from, is the element you just talked about putting these thought bubbles right there on the page. Because that seems to me like, you're basically talking about, look, like low leverage is addressing the symptoms, high leverage is addressing the root cause, and the root cause of all root causes is this stuff right here. So, putting those two together seemed very important. My question is this: when it comes to enrolling all these different people and representatives of different interests and whatever else, what is it that kind of by and large, big picture, that what's like the minimal effective dose of knowledge about this type of process to get them engaged and enrolled in doing it so that they're able to willingly take that rigorous look at all these loops and whatnot?
Well, that's a great question. Usually there is some convener who has some previous exposure to systems thinking, and believes that this approach could be beneficial to them and the diverse stakeholders whom they want to involve. And the amount of actual just-in-time education about systems thinking could be a few hours, a half a day, and to give people enough of a sense of what this might look like and how they might actually go about developing these insights and taking different actions as a result. Excuse me. And so the rest of the education would take place as they progressively contribute their perspective through interviews, usually work with two different groups, a decision-making group and a modeling team. Mm-hmm. And the modeling team helps us as consultants road test the initial set of insights, which we would then modify and bring to the decision makers involved. And then there are a series of stages that I would go through to take the principles of systems thinking and the basic tools of systems thinking and apply them over what I put in the book as a 4-stage change process to make it actually accessible and useful to people who have no previous experience with this.
And that 4-stage change process is the next subject we're going to talk about. But first, I'll just highlight this for everybody. Part of that, the shift for everyone involved in doing that work that David was just talking about, at least according to the book, this might be outdated by now, but back then when you wrote that book, you said there are a few major fundamental shifts in perspective that people have to undertake when approaching things in the systems way, focusing on shifting focus from individual isolated events and the urgent crises and fires, so to speak, shifting focus to like what's the deeper cause, like making that like, okay, that's what we're doing, we're starting with that. Next is shifting from just looking at, hey, I hope everybody else around me does things differently, to looking at what am I doing that's directly part of this. And then otherwise, which is just really just looking at the interactions rather than just isolated separate sections. So, okay, we're going to go to the 4-stage change process, which in other words, what does that mean? It means doing this work in a way that produces valuable insights and changes for people.
Right.
Right before we do that, 2 quick things. Number 1, thank you everybody for sending some Zoom comments. We're going to go over those very, very soon. I promised Tom, though, to give him a little space here to share something as well. So go ahead, Tom, and share with us something that's important for us to know.
Well, just that I guess there's a flow to Jared, who's leading the conversation and guiding the conversation, which is great. But sometimes also there are like objections or contrary perspectives that someone might have, but we call the elephant in the room types of questions. So you are welcome to share those, not with everyone because we don't want to distract from the flow, but you're welcome to share them with me in the chat. So if you go to the chat and you look for not everyone but Tom Bohan's Promethean, and if you just make your comments there or questions or controversial topics you want to bring up, the elephant in the room, if you see them, I play elephant spotter, and I will try to bring some of those into the Q&A portion at the end.
Cool. And so I think my understanding, Tom, of your purpose with that elephant in the room is, like, I mean, for example, David, like, what's the caveat of doing this type of work? Is it something like, it might, like, is there a caveat of like getting lost in details and abstractions, for example? Is that a potential elephant in the room of like, well, guys, what about da-da-da? Is that an example, Tom, of what you mean by elephants in the room? Things like that?
I think that's a great example. Another one that comes to my mind as I listen, for example, is, well, sometimes the short-term solution is actually necessary, even though you want the longer-term solution. So how do you reconcile it, for example? Might be tougher questions.
Okay.
Got it.
Well, let me start with yours, Tom. I think that one of the challenges with this work is that to be effective, it actually needs to be thinking both short-term and long-term. The assumption often is, oh, systems thinking, that's the long-term stuff. And then there's the real world of the short-term stuff. And what I would say is that a good systems thinker is helping people think about both the short-term and the long-term, but it's helping them think about the short-term within the context of the long-term. So one useful distinction to make is between a quick fix and a small success. We need small successes. We need to be able to demonstrate that either a new idea is worth investing in and sustaining investment in, or we need to survive in order to be able to thrive in the long term. So we need short-term successes. However, there's a difference between a short-term success and a quick fix. And the difference is this: a short-term success is consciously chosen because it supports a longer-term direction and purpose that people have. A quick fix, on the other hand, is whatever we can do that's expedient to keep our head above water or show that we're in control of the situation. And in politics, you talk about kicking the bucket down the road. You don't care what is accomplished in the long term, so long as you can demonstrate that you've done something in the short term. And that, to me, is not systems thinking. It's expedient. It may be survival thinking, but it's not within the purpose. It's not supportive of a meaningful longer-term purpose that benefits the largest group of stakeholders in the system.
It seems like one thing that also maps to that is just bringing in together the focus on the problem and the actual goal. Like, in other words, the short term and the, so a couple questions will go from the Zoom to kind of go through these. And then it seems, David, like the compulsion to measure and track measurements, is that the motivation behind the quick fix over the long term? In other words, is there sometimes a bias towards what is immediately measurable? Is that where that?
I think there's a bias toward measuring outcomes versus processes. So, the outcomes would be the number of homeless people on the street. The outcome would be the number of people who are still starving, if we're talking about hunger and food aid. So if we tend to confuse the metric associated with the desired outcome we want with the metrics that are better suited, what we might call leading indicators, to what needs to be put in place for those longer term, those outcomes, those desired outcomes to be achieved in a sustainable way. So in the case of homeless, coming back to the homeless example, because we've all looked at it together, measuring the number of shelter beds filled is not an appropriate metric for the long term. On the other hand, looking to cultivate new relationships among the diverse stakeholders in the system, the shelter providers, the public sector, the private sector. To what extent are those folks talking together? To what extent are they thinking even about the differences between the short term and the long term? Those to me would be process indicators in the short term that would suggest to me that people are either moving in the right direction or not.
Right. And just for everybody listening, my understanding of all this is not to bias short or long term. It's real. I think Robert Fritz does a great job of this. He talks about it, there are some people who by their natural tendencies are very big picture, zoomed out, and then other people who are much more myopic or detail centered. But he says he goes into a lot of great detail about how to be centered between those two things. And therefore, in other words, it's some people zooming out and some people zooming in and meeting in the middle where these, often different approaches become usable and really beneficial together. I got a great question. Next question here from Andrew, which is about really like scoping. In other words, you said with Einstein not to make it too simple, not to make it too complicated. If you don't want to include all of the factors in understanding a system, what decision process should be used to determine the essential factors?
Great question. Great question. So I always like to tell people a systems map is not designed to map a system. So what is it designed to map? And what it's designed to map is the answer to a focusing question. And the focusing question is a why question. Why, in this case with homelessness, why, despite our best efforts to reduce homelessness or end homelessness, does it keep increasing? Despite all the money we're throwing at it, why does it keep increasing? And what that focusing question does is it helps us as analysts and helps the stakeholders focus on the minimum critical variables to answer the question. If you wanted to map the quote unquote system, you would end up with a spaghetti diagram pretty quickly that was very comprehensive, very complicated, and would totally obscure the essence of why the problem persists and what needs to be done to achieve it.
Right. It sounds like, just to reflect that, doing all of this with intention, with why are we doing this? Okay, we're going to map this out so we have a better and more condensed, connected understanding of all these factors. But, for the purpose of changing any of those factors that are the answer to that question, why is this happening in the way that finding that out to then change it. Okay.
Yeah.
Another question. I'm gonna turn this to Brian actually, because I want to make sure to get the question right. Can you ask your question, Brian, about with respect to learning environments and adaptive systems? Brian.
Yeah. I was just in the process of messaging Tom along similar lines. So I had an underlying question back to David to some extent. He was saying that he sees systems change as a process of intention, belief, and I was hoping to get a little clarification on that, because what I know of systems, or think I know of systems change or transformation at this point, have been looking primarily at combined intention and attention, somewhat with respect to the physics involved. So thanks for letting me share that. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. So if we go back to the homelessness case, there are two different competing intentions. The espoused intention, what people say they want to accomplish, is to end homelessness. But this system, the way Jared is depicting it there, is not designed to end homelessness. It's actually designed to help people cope with homelessness. Those are two different intentions. And in order for this system to shift, people first need to understand that what they are doing is making decisions, making choices that help people cope with homelessness at the expense of ending it.
Right.
And
So
if they
that
want to
does-
design, hold on, if they want to design a system to end homelessness, then they have to make different choices and take different actions.
Yeah,
Yes.
no, that makes total sense to me, but is that what you just described, is that not a case then of essentially throwing money at or attempting to treat the symptoms rather than the underlying cause?
Absolutely. But people need to see what they're doing. See, they think that they're committed to ending homelessness. They say they're committed to ending homelessness. But if you show them what they're actually doing, that's not what they're doing at all. And one has to, if the system is going to change, they're going to have to be aware of the distinction between those two different intentions and make some choices
And I think
about what they want to do with their limited resources.
So to refine my question a little bit, then wouldn't this approach to homelessness be better served around an inquiry that examined causality in terms of, I mean, to do anything that is approaching being a generative solution to the underlying problem, rather than, as I say, just kind of dealing with the symptoms or continuing to stay stuck in the problem. It would seem to appropriate or necessitate a shared appreciation or inquiry with regard to causality, right?
Sure. And absolutely. And if one helps people shift their attention to creating affordable housing from homelessness, what are the forces that are supportive of increased affordable housing, and what are the ones that undermine it? What are the forces that lead people to be homeless in the first place? And how can you mitigate those forces? So you would absolutely need to expand the scope of inquiry and the scope of engagement. Now, economic development in this particular community was a major issue. And so these people were not the economic developers, but they could certainly call attention to the need to engage those people who are addressing economic development in the community and say, if we want to address the homelessness case, we've got to, do a better job around economic development and job creation. We've got to do a better job of affordable housing. We've got to do a better job of motivating citizenry to support affordable housing and to to help homeless people become, to the extent that they can, more productive members of society. So all of those things do need to be taken into account.
So homelessness is one issue, and it's especially important to me because of my own experience in that regard. I shared a recently published article entitled Anathema on medium.com, kind of chronicling my entire narrative or story along those lines. But in addition to homelessness, I see comparable situation involving incarceration. And to some extent, then you have dominant kind of status quo systems that are in place that I mean, if you're going to look at it really objectively, and you start to question how much of this dysfunction perpetuates the powerlessness and learned helplessness with respect to these populations. And that, having been homeless for 5.5 years myself, I have an acute, appreciation for the systems and what it took for me to do to basically, rise above, finding myself embedded. Basically, powerlessness. There, I see the process solution, of being one of empowering and assuring liberation. And
well, I think
those are very, very, very basic primary elements of human existence, human development.
absolutely, Brian. And what I would say is that empowerment is a critical aspect of this work. Power dynamics can be a critical aspect of the work. And it's very important to consider and get the direct voice in the room of the ultimate population that you want to serve. So in the homelessness case, which is in my book, and there's also, by the way, one on mass incarceration, in both those cases, the voice of the homeless person or the voice of the formerly incarcerated person are explicit in the understanding of why that problem persists and what to do about it. And too often we
guys, I'm gonna interrupt us here.
Please go ahead.
We're up by the top of the hour. Eyes on me for a moment, everybody. Everybody, do us a favor. Send a message of what you might have learned in the past hour. 1 point, 1 comment. Drop it in the everyone chat. We're gonna shift topics to leadership. Now, a lot of what is underlying what you were both just talking about brilliantly is this idea of structural conflict, right? Where, different, like, in other words, what's happening is just what's happening. But in the structure that exists at the lowest level, the deepest level, at the level of intention and belief, mental model, that's where these structural conflicts occur, where different intentions compete. And that can be within, an entire world, an organization, within an individual person. But if we're talking about leadership, David, are we not talking about making the choice of which of those factors becomes dominant?
Well, I would say from a leadership perspective, the most important thing to recognize about leading systems change is that you have to be operating at multiple levels. You need to help people change the way they think. You need to have the emotional intelligence to work with the emotional attachments, Jared, that you mentioned at the top of the hour, that people have to how they think. Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am." We tend to be very identified with our thinking, often to our detriment. And so helping people work with the emotional aspects of this work is very important. There's a behavioral component. We need to be able to help people work together to see more of the system that they're all a part of. And then I would close by saying that this work is spiritual work. It involves the cultivation of character traits like humility, curiosity, compassion and respect, courage, patience, persistence. If you want to work effectively with a system, you have to develop and cultivate those leadership and human qualities.
So what I'd love to do now in our remaining hour is take a look at this leadership model. And in a way, what I was just talking about, David, when I said, this part right here about making an explicit choice, to me seems very interesting because it's, and we'll go through what this exactly means, but I'm sort of framing it up by this as saying, once you have mapped out, in other words, let me go through this. Can you guys see my cursor, my mouse, where it is on the screen, on top of this picture? Like if I'm, yeah, okay. So let me introduce this to everybody, and then David, take us away from here, and I'll give the sort of special focus that I'm seeing this with. You get all these people together, these stakeholders interested in the homeless situation. And the first step with everybody is to build that foundation for change and get people ready to do this, ready to embrace those, pursuits of curiosity and everything else. The next stage is understanding the current situation. And that's where using all of these, these maps and these diagrams, that fits in right there, because, we want to solve, we already decided we want to solve the problem. Let's look at what the problem's actually, what it actually is. Stage 3 is about what do we want instead of that, and making that an explicit choice. And that's what I meant by, in terms of structural conflict, in the sense of sort of facing exactly head on. Oh yeah, you know what? I guess I did have an intention about this, and that is what was driving that behavior. But I'm going to select to embrace this choice instead. That's what I meant by one thing becoming dominant. Like there's really like a choice of one thing over another at that point. And I'm curious if you can talk about that, and just, that seems like a really important moment for people in these sessions. It must be. But then last but not least is, like, what are the action steps, so to speak? Like, what are the, like, now that we're aligned on the actual new choice, what does that look like to do it? That's my take on this after reading your book. But can you walk us through this model in terms of what I would say is how there, it almost seems like you've put out these like pivot points of what our focus needs to be if we're going to be engaging in this activity. Like we start from just, okay, let's get ready for this. Like, okay, we're going to change our way of thinking. Yep. Okay, great. To now, what is really going on in reality? Okay, got it. And now what do we want? And now what do we need to do day by day? So, but can you walk us through that?
Yeah. And then I'm actually going to have to briefly step out because I thought this was an hour, and I'm going to have to communicate with someone about the rest of the time. And then I will stay on. So very quickly here, Jared, building on the what Robert Fritz, I'm sure, would have talked about, is the principle of creative tension. That in order to move ourselves forward as individuals, in order to move a group of people forward, we need to anchor ourselves in two different states. What do we want, and where are we? And recognizing the discrepancy between those two creates a tension that we seek to resolve. And we can either resolve that tension in favor of what we want, or by continuing to move toward what we want while simultaneously telling the truth about where we are or we can end up denying what we want and just sort of coming back to the status quo and say, okay, well, we've got what we've got. So in order to manage this tension constructively, we need to help stakeholders, if we're working with a group, align around a shared direction, a shared sense of where they want to go, and a shared understanding of not only where they are, but why they are where they are. So stage one is about establishing that creative tension, which is what builds the readiness for change. And then step two is saying, let's double click on the where are we part of this. And the reason for doing that is there's another elephant metaphor that often gets used, and this is the story of the blind men and the elephant. So it's an ancient Sufi story of different blind people touching different parts of an elephant, swearing that the part of the elephant that they're connected with is the whole thing. So a blind person touching the hair of the elephant would be saying this is like a brush. The blind person touching the trunk of the elephant would say like this is a hose, or touching the leg of the elephant saying this is a tree trunk, and so on. All of them are swearing that reality is the part of the elephant that they are immediately in touch with. But nobody sees the elephant as a whole. And so building on this metaphor, what systems thinking is about is helping all of those blind people see more of the quote unquote elephant, the reality of what it is that they're dealing with and trying to change. And that's where, as you point out, all of these tools come in. And the end result of facing current reality more clearly is one, developing this shared understanding of the elephant, and particularly very important, understanding one's own contribution to why the problem is persisting. Because ultimately, again, the greatest control you have over the system is through understanding your own intentions, your own thinking, and your own behavior. Once people deepen their appreciation of what's going on and their role in that, not just in the solutions, but in the problems themselves, we can raise this question of choice. The system is perfectly designed to, let's say, help people cope with homelessness. But you say you want to end homelessness. Seems like there is a choice that you need to make. Now, to the extent that there's some kind of both and, we don't want to kick people out on the street while we're building the affordable housing. But on the other hand, if we just keep investing in shelters and not in affordable housing, we're never going to get there. So how do we deal with this choice and possibly this both and that we're dealing with? And once we now are more explicitly committed to what we say we want to accomplish, with a deeper appreciation of the investments we might need to make, the trade-offs that we might need to make, the payoffs to the way things are that we may need to let go of over time in service of something that's even more important to us. When we go through all of that and say, no, this is what we really want. We really want to end homelessness, for example. Then we can talk meaningfully about how you bridge the gap between where we are and what we want. And this is the conversation about leverage, the conversation about short-term successes in service of long-term successes, and also the importance of correction. Brian mentioned complex adaptive systems. These insights need to be continuously revisited There needs to be a system for continuous learning as we engage more, understand more of the system, deal with some of the changes that are taking place around us, and so on. So it's not one and done. It's this process and then re-engaging this process over time.
That was a
And
wonderful.
I need to step out for 1 minute in order to deal with a particular.
So for everyone who's here during that 1 minute, does that description, what does everyone think about that description of that process? You know, we start with establishing an initial look at that creative tension as an overview. You know, we're here, we want to go here, an overview. Then double click, go into the full picture of current reality, including our own role in that problem that's there. Next, make the choice. Hey, are we truly motivated to keep the system as it is, change it, or merge them, both and somehow? And then finally, once that explicit primary choice or commitment is made, now it's time to do what people often start with anyway, which is what's the next steps, and keeping not only accountability, but continuous learning and correction along those lines. I would love to hear anyone talk about what landed for them in that, including Molly, who, for example, just got on video. So do you have anything you want to share about that?
Yeah, so when he's talking through that part, I'm starting to see what I think is the root cause of how we get off track in many different types of systems. And it's either the inability to be honest, not really the intentional inability to be honest about our own outcomes that we want, or why the problem is what it is, or even agreeing on what the problem is. It's not really that there's an intention to be dishonest there, but I think there's a lot of coaches in this group, in the breakout rooms. I've run into a lot of other coaches, and I think we've all kind of identified that ability to honestly assess our own motivations as individuals and as teams and as leaders is a root cause behind why many things end up, getting off track. And I was starting to see that come out of this discussion.
Right. The importance of honesty is as either like an entry stakes, or as David was talking about, something that you grow in this pursuit, I suppose. Anyone else want to reflect on what we just went over in terms of this change model? We see one here that this reflects the to grow model. And any comments on this? Any questions about it before we go even deeper? Nick.
Jared, not really a question, more an observation that I think that often people don't know their own minds, that there may be one part of them that really wants a particular direction or outcome, and another part that sees something else, and that kind of ambivalence has to be resolved somehow. I'm not sure I see how the model does it just yet.
Well, so, okay, that actually, both of those comments from Molly and Nick really dovetail well with how I personally would love to focus the remainder of our conversation, which, David, if it's all right with you, is the use of this type of platform in a coaching context. In other words, we're taking it from the macro to more of an individual coaching world, where those questions that both Molly and Nick brought up are extraordinarily relevant. And if I may say one thing in particular that hopefully is illustrative here. I wrote Robert an email saying, hey, what would you describe as the difference between how you approach problems or situations and how David does? And he gave me a response, but here's what I think, here's what I observe. And I'm curious if you have things that you can bring to light about this, because I think I feel that there's something beneficial available here, if so. What I noticed Robert doing in particular on his YouTube channel with the interviews is that, I mean, obviously he's doing a structural consultation, which is, informed by systems. But the key thing that I'm pointing out is, rather than diagramming out everything, he'll do that once in a while, but by and large, he's just having a verbal conversation. And so therefore there's some way to adapt all this complexity to the simple interface of a conversation. And I feel like if there's anything we could say about that, I think that would be incredibly beneficial for people, just as far as like, if you are, let's say, in an hour-long coaching session with someone, how can you put yourself there as a coach so that you are picturing their situation and helping them do so, and maybe bringing a technique informed by this without spending, the several months to gather research and interviews. In other words, is there a way to adapt the benefit of this type of thinking to a conversational experience?
Well, I will say two different things on that. One is the scope of my work is dealing with larger systems and the people within it. And so I like to say that systems thinking is a team sport. It is something that really requires multiple people who are involved in the system to be looking at together to see how they're all contributing unwittingly to the situation and all requiring to make some shifts in how they think and approach things. That being said, working with an individual leader in a system, one of the simplest kind of causal feedback loops to be thinking about is something called an interaction map that was developed by a group called Action Design about 30 years ago. And it's a very simple feedback loop that starts with how party A thinks, which leads to how they act. Based on how they act, it leads party B to think a particular way, which leads party B to act in certain ways that reinforce then how party A thinks. So if you're thinking, for example, about the connection between a supervisor and someone reporting to the supervisor, if the supervisor thinks that, let's say, Bob, who is the subordinate, is not very motivated and not very detail oriented, so the manager thinks, Bob is this kind of way, and therefore what I will do is I've got to manage him more closely than I might manage somebody else. And so the manager starts what otherwise might be thought of as micromanaging. And when the manager micromanages Bob, Bob thinks, geez, he doesn't trust me. And he's a pain in the ass. Let him do it. And so Bob thinks, it's not worth it. I'm not trusted. He's going to double check and triple check everything I do all the time anyhow. To hell with him, let him do it. So Bob actually becomes more passive. And as a result of Bob becoming more passive, his manager thinks that Bob isn't on top of things. And therefore, the manager is going to have to micromanage him. And you can see that as a vicious cycle playing out over time. Now, if you're consulting to the manager and you're frustrated with Bob, and the manager is frustrated with Bob, you might poke around and have the manager think about, well, what are your assumptions about Bob? And what does that lead you to do? And when you do that, what do you think Bob might be thinking? And how might Bob react? And can you see how that plays back into how you're thinking about Bob? And ultimately, the greatest leverage that the manager has in that system is over the extent that he assumes that Bob isn't very responsible and acts in ways that actually reduce Bob's level of responsibility, sense of responsibility. And the manager can do something about that. So yes, you can take this down to the coaching level of working with an individual. And I worked with a larger system, let's say last year, and one of the key insights from the manager was that he was contributing to the frustration among his entire team by not managing his immediate subordinate very well. And he changed the way he related to that subordinate so that they became actually more of a team in overseeing the entire organization that he was responsible for. So it's a both and to me.
Yeah,
and I love the coaching aspect of this because the sense of personal responsibility, the awareness of personal responsibility, the need to, I would say, introduce tough love or ruthless compassion as we work with people are totally aligned, whether you're working at the individual level or at that larger system level.
when you say ruthless compassion, that reminds me of a thing called Landmark and EST and programs like that. And I'm wondering, you know, that almost seems like its own example of system level change for individuals. That kind of, you know, I mean, and you know, it's interesting because there's even, and we're gonna, you know, there's been psychological blah 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 like paradigms, you know, internal systems, and it's always interesting because sometimes those are more, you know, conceptual, I guess, than rigorously modeled, but they're like diagrammed, like flows of experience ultimately. So it's interesting to consider where the line gets drawn.
Well, I would just raise one comment about that, because as I was entering the field, these at the time they were called New Age approaches to personal growth, including EST and ultimately Landmark and so on. Some of the participants in those programs were so excited about them that they brought them back wholesale to their organizations and created a lot of grief. Because you cannot simply change a system by growing everyone or trying to grow everyone individually. An organization obviously requires people who feel empowered and who have that sense of personal responsibility in their work. But unless you're also looking at the clarity around shared goals and shared metrics and incentives and reporting relationships and clarity of roles and so on and so forth, you're just going to make everyone in that organization feel even more frustrated. Right. And so it's an element of organization or system-wide change, but you can't just simply add more and more personally responsible people and create an effective organization, not right. In and of itself.
You got to also zoom out and see what, you know, bring people to that level. So fantastic. And by the way, I want to, for the rest of our time, talk about some of the current social change, you know, anything that you want to share, like from the depths of your own focus and scope. Does that make sense? Like wherever you're finding things to be, like, you know, whether it's specific, you know, challenges or situations or specific tools that emerge, or really anything that you would find helpful for us or even helpful for yourself to share about with respect to what really is the center of the bullseye for your use of these tools, right? But if it's okay, I know we have a couple questions first, and I want to start with Tom. And then Tom, can you ask your question and then pass it off to Molly? And I think we had one more question after that. And then we'll go to what I just said, David, in terms of the current scope.
So what our questions and then what David really cares about. That sounds great. So my question, David, is I understand and completely value this tension creating between what we want and where we are today. And the challenge I have is that you can do that for a big thing like homelessness. But then how do you what's the best way to identify the factors that are necessary to have what you want and the factors that are constraining you to what you have? Because that really gets into the gnarly part about the system, and then it seems like there's like an unlimited number of little tensions that you have to identify in there. But how do you expose those? What works effectively for you?
Well, it's very important, Tom, and everyone, to ask what I would call systemic questions, because systemic questions produce systemic insights. And some of those questions, and I actually list 10 in my book, plus examples from particular cases, including, I believe, the homelessness case, the specific questions that we asked for that case. One of them is this why question. Why does the problem persist despite your best efforts to improve it? Another one is, if you think you know the solution, why haven't you implemented it? People tend to come into these situations with their favorite solutions. And if everyone was as smart as they were and understood what they understand about the system would change. So the job of everyone coming in is to convince everyone else of their solution, which is usually to optimize their part of the system. Because remember, I'm here because I feel responsible for the solution. So that's a challenging question for people. It kind of slows them down. Along with that is, what have you tried already? And what happened as a result? And that's very useful in uncovering both what moves things forward and where some of the non-obvious blockages are that emerge once people actually start taking action. Another one is, what might be the unintended consequences of your proposed solutions? So people are going to say, we need to add another shelter, or we need to send more food aid. Okay, well, where do you think that would get you in the short term? But what might be some of the unintended longer term consequences? The exact same thing.
Yeah, and are there some like techniques to facilitate that exploration that you personally dislike that are your best? Like, there's 1, 2, 4 all in liberating structures, or how do you get people to actually
those questions, you mean?
No, I love the questions. How do you get a group of 50 people to process those questions?
Well, first of all, I would rarely do this with 50 people at a time. There are some colleagues in the field who like to develop very complex maps with 100 people at a time, and I'm not one of them. In fact, I have a blog post on making systems mapping accessible. And one of the things I do is a lot of interviewing up front, creating a modeling team that will help me test my initial hypotheses about what's going on and refine those hypotheses, then working with the decision-making body, and then perhaps after that, working with a larger group of 50 or 100 people. But it's a very iterative process, and one where I'm making sure that the mapping does not get out of hand, so that it becomes very complicated and comprehensive, but not very insightful.
Yeah. So you're creating enough cohesion that people can connect to it, right?
Exactly. And it's staged to do that. To me, the goal of ruthless compassion is to help people see how they are hurting themselves without even realizing it. And the ruthlessness is to cut through the blindness, to cut through the arrogance at times, but with the compassion to support that person or that system to help them achieve what they really care about. And it's definitely a both end.
That's a good description of it. I know in your book it kind of relates to what you say is of being confrontational but compassionate and not contemptuous. Not contemptuous. Can you just for a quick moment tell us about that? Like that seems like a crucial distinction on the human factors level.
Well, all of us, we're all imperfect. And I think it really starts with having compassion for oneself and being humble about one's own mistakes, being committed to being a better person and to making more of a difference in the world, whatever that means to you. And to recognize that you're both your own greatest asset and potentially your own greatest enemy. And starting from there. And so when you talk about the relationship between leadership and systems, that's a very important part of it right there, is to help the leader appreciate all of that they're their greatest asset, they're their greatest enemy. And how do we work together to help you further becoming your own greatest asset and not get in your own way so much?
Right. So let's shift our focus to what we said as far as, David, what are some active areas of focus for you using all these tools in your world? And by the way, welcome back, Rose. I think Rose has a great question to add to this, but let's let David, start with the applications in the larger social big picture systems.
Well, a lot of my work over the years since the book was published has been around the issue of equity and equitable access to resources, part of which is associated with racism, but not entirely. And I published an article in, I think, 2000 in the Foundation Review on overcoming the systemic challenges of wealth inequality, and recognizing that while globalization has actually lifted many, many people out of poverty around the world, it has actually increased the amount of wealth inequality within developed nations, including the US. And I've currently submitted an article called Overcoming the Simultaneous or Addressing the Simultaneous Problems of Climate Change, Racial Tension, and Authoritarian Leadership, which to me are all amplified by wealth inequality, and all of which in turn amplify wealth inequality. So the people who are slowing down the level of aggressive actions that need to take place around climate change are usually or often people in the fossil fuel industry and who benefit from that industry. How do you sustain the wealth that you have and further concentrate wealth and power by dividing people, and particularly dividing people in the blue collar fields and working class, what might be called working class. I mean, we're all working, into, you know, my group versus the other groups, and fanning increasing suspicion and hatred or mistrust or fear of the other, whether it be minorities in your own country or immigrants. And of course, the immigration problem and the refugee problem is also amplified by climate change. And so that's the racial tension side. And so you kind of create this additional, or you intensify the mistrust between majority and minority groups. And then you come in as the law and order people who will protect you from the others that you have successfully seeded people's fears about. And so you maintain power by offering to protect one group from the other group. And all of these things play together. So while again, that's exceedingly simplistic and macro, I think there is a lot of value to recognizing that this issue of wealth inequality has lots of ripple effects. And if we want to address any of those other problems, we need to be thinking about wealth inequality as a major aspect of that, of all of them.
I have two. Thank you for sharing that. I have two questions relating to that. One of which is, maybe this isn't the exact term for it, but there's this idea called ungrounded models, where like when you're working with such major issues, how do you create an understanding of like, okay, we can trust these facts as being true enough to incorporate into our perspective here, and getting people just on the same page about what reality is when it becomes that widely measured?
Well, I think that it's a great question. And I would never use a model like that with a client that I know of because it is too macro. When I have dealt with equity issues, it's been around equitable access to K through 12 education or to healthcare within a county of 40,000 people or a city of 2 million people, or something like that. So how is wealth inequality playing into this, and how do you increase upward mobility? And there's a graspable set of stakeholders who are interested in this and you can work with. When I write about this in these articles, it's more a consciousness raising type of activity. And yes, there's tons of references in those articles to both qualitative and quantitative data. So they're not just pulled out of the pie in the sky. But remember, this work is, in part, I would call narrative therapy. It's helping people see the stories they are telling themselves and to recognize that they can create a different story, a different narrative that would produce a different outcome. And so this is very much about, these models are about theory building, they're about storytelling, they're about challenging people to recognize how big issues are connected to each other and to possibly change the way they, what they fund or how they fund it, based on these broader insights. but it's not the same thing as working with a modeling team and a decision-making group and so on.
Right. Like it's not the same thing as having, hands on the control essentially of the data that actually reflects your own reality.
Right.
Okay, so this next question is brought to us by Rose, who earlier on in this conversation messaged, as I requested in the Zoom, and brought up this important question, and you can add clarification to this, but I'll just say, do you see how would we apply this, or how would people in charge of this issue apply this when it comes to crises unfolding in the Middle East presently?
Oh, okay. Well, I'm actually about to write a blog post on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which I originally wrote an article about when I lived there at the beginning of the Second Intifada. So this was 2000, 2001. And at that point, the questions were, why now and who's to blame? Which are not good systems questions, by the way. The question is more, why has this problem persisted in the, now 75 years since the declaration of Israel as an independent state? Or to what extent does it even go back to Abraham sending Hagar and Ishmael into the desert? And creating the original separation, if you will, between Jews and Arabs in the biblical sense. And I developed a systems analysis of the conflict that actually produced some very interesting responses. Wasn't long enough in Israel to do much with it, but it attracted the interest of the peace building community that worked on global issues like Northern Ireland and Cyprus and other identity-based conflicts, of which this was one. And we collectively then developed a generic model of the system dynamics of identity-based conflicts. And I did some peace building work in different parts of the world using this set of tools. And now I looked at that article and comparing it to the nature of this particular breakout now, and recognizing both similarities in the dynamics and some important differences. So absolutely, these tools can be used for that purpose.
Rose, is there anything you would want to ask in terms of that issue?
Well, I look forward to reading your blog. It is top of mind for many and myself. And I'm sorry to have missed. I had internet connection. They're repairing something. Sorry, I got kicked out.
Welcome back.
It's just that there's so much emotion. There's huge suffering, horrific suffering. And I really want there to be some sort of solution down the road. I don't think it's possible right now, but maybe it is. But I'm not sure. It goes back to what you said, David, about human nature. And, does human nature at some point, it's so big that we can only sort of resolve a few systems within the system.
Well, I think that's true. And, how can I say it? You can only make improvements where you can make improvements, and hope that you're making some kind of a difference, that it has some kind of ripple effects. And you always have to start with where you are and the parts of the system that you have some kind of control or influence over. I would say that in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, for example, that the greatest conflict is not between the Israelis and the Palestinians. The greatest conflict is between those groups in each nation or society that favor dominance as a way of resolving conflict versus those in those same societies that seek some kind of peaceful coexistence. That's the conflict that ultimately needs to be addressed. And what was true in 2000 is true now, that the extremists on both sides, those who believe that they can get their way through dominance versus coexistence, usually are the ones in the end, sadly, who play the tune for everybody else because of the powerful emotions of fear and anger that their behaviors tend to produce.
Couple things come to mind here. Rose, you mentioned there's so much emotion in there. And what I find really important to point out here is, we talk about mental models, assumptions, beliefs, and separately we talk about emotions. When, from a psychodynamic perspective, emotions are what hold those all in place and keep them whatever they are. I guess, in addressing challenges of this scope and severity, where there is, so much emotion and these different ways of thinking, what can be done to just diffuse some of the raw emotionality that can be involved in major problems, to not get rid of it, but to limit its present impact on being able to assess?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things is to legitimize the emotions. You have to do that. People have their rights to be angry, they have their rights to be mistrustful, et cetera, et cetera. There's always evidence, lived experience they've had that justify those feelings or demonstrate why those feelings should be there. And then to, once those emotions have an adequate kind of outlet and legitimacy to them, is ask people to what extent those emotions and the beliefs that associated with them serve them right now to accomplish what they want to accomplish right now. Wonderful things I learned from Robert Fritz, and I'm not sure he would quite use these words, but similar idea. Says it's not whether your beliefs are valid or not, because the answer is always yes. Because they're always based on your past experience, and you can always point to your past experience to justify what you're thinking or feeling. He said the question is not, is it valid, but is it useful? Do those beliefs, do those emotions serve you in accomplishing what you really want to accomplish? And that can, I believe, help open up people to considering different ways of thinking that would better serve them going forward.
Right. I have a note somewhere from, I'm going to find it right now. Something about exactly that. Yeah, in other words, okay, if there's an intense amount of emotions, legitimizing them, and then for the beliefs associated with them, you look at them, you surface them, very much like Robert does in his one-on-one consulting, by the way. Just like, okay, that's your belief. And then, does this help me create this result? And, what are some alternatives? And, what are some, like, that opens the door to, like, in other words, the power of the explicit choice. You're talking about like consciousness raising. To me, it's very much like the larger framework becomes the explicit choice, in which relationship in relationship to that, the belief becomes less important. And that's sort of how that seems to happen. But thank you for answering that with respect to the excuse me, when emotions are really high.
One thing I just want to raise in terms of another place to apply this in your own life, and there are tons of places, by the way, but if you are in a marriage or long-term committed relationship, I remember an old girlfriend of mine saying, who had been married twice by that time, by the way, saying that marriage is like an ongoing workshop. And it continuously presents these types of challenges between trying to optimize life as you would like to live it if you weren't married, in a way, and doing what it takes to support the relationship, the larger system that you have chosen to be part of, because in doing that, it meets other needs that you have and other aspirations that you have that you couldn't meet if you were single. So you're choosing to support one level of system, which is called the relationship, when it sometimes even contrasts or conflicts with how you would do something if you were living by yourself. And that multiplied is similar to the types of challenges we face in the larger systems that we're part of.
I can relate, first off, but I heard you and Tom talking at the beginning of this conversation, or maybe right before everyone showed up, about Dave Snowden's work. And I'm curious if you ever utilize frameworks, to say, okay, no, this is a complex situation. All right, no, this is a clear cut. Or does that type of thinking ever factor into how you approach problems?
I'm aware of the framework. And I would say that, my work tends to be with complex systems, not complicated ones. I like the distinction that Peter Senge made years ago between static complexity and dynamic complexity, where static complexity is something that I would now call complicated. It's got lots of different parts, all of which are connected, but it's not the dynamic shifts between those different parts that's so much of interest as just what are those different parts and how are they connected in time.
Wow.
When you're looking at dynamic complexity, you're looking at all of that, but how it all changes over time. And that's the type of work that I think anyone involved in social change and sustainable development, those are the types of challenges that we're facing.
Fantastic. Now, I want to give everyone a chance. If you mentioned your blog, where can we find some of those blog articles, like the one you mentioned?
So, yes. So I have a website called bridgewaypartners.com.
One last thing, which is, about you mentioned distinctly having a map creating team.
Mm-hmm.
like in terms of people who are really interested in doing that type of work, is there anything you would say as far as, what kind of tools to use or what kind of skills to sharpen in terms of really doing that work?
Well, I think that the basic tools are covered in the book.
I mean in terms of like softwares or things like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
There is some. I actually just use PowerPoint to draw these diagrams with. There is some other software that people have tried over the years. It's nothing I've really been able to grab onto. There's also a quantifiable methodology here, which is called system dynamics, and is the progenitor of systems thinking. And that is all based on computer modeling and quantifying the relationships that here we're talking about in a qualitative way. But that requires an additional level of expertise and an additional level of investment, and runs the risk of becoming a black box for people. What I love about this qualitative work is it really does allow people with very limited exposure to this to fairly quickly qualitatively test their own hypotheses, challenge their own ways of thinking, and start to consider shifts.
Fantastic. May we all do exactly that. And thank you, David, for spending time with us and sharing.
You're very welcome. Thank you all for being there. And I look forward to hearing from those of you who, you think could benefit from that.
Great.
Thank you all. Thank you, Tom and Jared, for putting this together.